Hi guys, today we're going to go over a little bit about slavery in the colonies. There's a couple of slides I wanted to add, but my Wi-Fi is currently not working. So I'll do what I can with this here right now. I'm sure you've learned about slavery a lot in the past, and what we're going to focus on with this is slavery in the colonies. So this is before the revolution. This is before we become the United States. Eli Whitney's cotton gin didn't come around until he invented it in 1794. So we've been a country for a while. There's a constitution, right? So when the Declaration came about, the founders actually thought that slavery was on its way out. And because of the Enlightenment and all that it would be out the window within a few years. And it wasn't until things that changed that made slavery actually become a much more, I don't even know what the right word is, but like a stronghold in early American history. So let's go over a little bit about what slavery was like before the revolution. So learning about the English in the Americas. England was in the New World, and they had plantations. What they were trying to do was to replicate the success that the Spanish already had. They read about how successful the Spanish were in Mexico and Peru, how they were very organized, how they worked with native nations that were there. And the English basically assumed that something like that can happen in Virginia as well. But they didn't know much about Virginia. You'll read in several places the saying that the English knew less about Virginia than we know about Mars. And English also assumed that Virginia had a climate sort of like the Mediterranean. And slavery in the old world did focus around the Mediterranean. Okay. The English sent to Jamestown people that had military backgrounds. Remember in that other video, we saw the chart of what jobs they had. And we said, what are gentlemen going to do? Why do they only have this many carpenters or this many farmers? They sent people who didn't really know how to become farmers. And things were getting messy there, basically. So it wasn't going just like they hoped, okay? So tobacco was exhausting the soil every few years. It wasn't happening the way they were planning. Tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop. And so by 1620, labor becomes a problem in the colonies. The British still knew nothing much about slavery at this time. There wasn't really slavery in Northern Europe. The slaves that were in Williamsburg, the first slaves were brought in 1619. Well, they were already exchanged for food because of the starvation they had going on there. There were very few people of African ancestry shown in their census between 1624 and 1625. And slavery evolved in the 1600s as a very slow process here. There weren't many being brought. Indentured servitude was actually the preferred method. Basically, these were unfree people in England. So they didn't have freedom, but they weren't technically slaves. It's this weird gray area. They were bound to service for a period of time, and then they would be free after years. But so for every indentured person a Virginian brought over, they would be able to purchase land at a low price, so like an additional 50 acres. So it was sort of a functioning economic system then. The Indian population was also decreasing very rapidly. So the idea of using natives the way the Spanish did didn't look like it was going to be a thing either. Okay, the plantations were based on indentured servants. There were slavery in the Americas, but not so much here yet. Thousands of slaves were brought for Barbados, for example, for sugar, and there were still very few slaves in British Virginia. Slaves cost more than indentured servants, and they didn't live any longer than indentured servants, so it still wasn't economically viable just yet. But by the 60s and 70s, the availability of potential indentured servants in England was dropping off. So you have the supply of indentured servants is decreasing, but the number of colonies is increasing, right? And this is what fosters the need for slaves. So the Royal African Company had a monopoly, and it ended in 1698. And what that did is it opened up the prospect for more slaves coming to the colonies, and to be able to bring more slaves for a lower price. So unfortunately, this was about economics and supply and demand. So from 1700 to 1705, more Africans were imported to the Chesapeake area in Virginia than all of the other years combined. So this is actually when the most were brought over in these few years. Now, 10 to 12 million slaves in total were brought to the Americas during the slave trade. 76% of all of those slaves were brought between 1701 and 1810. So in that like 100 or so year period. But half went to the Dutch, French, or British plantations that were in the Caribbean. A third went to Brazil. A tenth went to Spanish America. And only about 5% went to the North American British colonies, which doesn't undermine the fact that slavery was in the American colonies, but just realize that compared to the other areas, there was less. Okay, so we have this here. We have different, and the way slaves came to the different parts of the colonies were also different. So you have the Old South. 24% of all white households owned slaves. Of those, only half of them owned 5 slaves or more. And in order to be called a planter, you needed to have at least 20 slaves. Only 12% of slave owners had that many. And we always think of the plantations owners in the South. There was only about 2,000, actually less than 2,000 plantations in the South. So that really wasn't the bulk of everything. But there were slaves in the middle colonies. There were slaves in the northern colonies. There were just less of them as compared to these areas. So to give you some examples, I have examples somewhere. Like in the North, most of the people that had slaves were the rich. And the Quakers were in the middle of the North, and they were the first to oppose slavery. They were like the first abolitionists. They didn't really gain much traction until the Revolution. So there were some slaves up the North, just not as much. I think, did I say it before, or is it in this next slide maybe? That, here it is. Virginia was a slave economy. The other colonies were economies with slaves. So you see the Virginia colonies, slavery was a necessity for them to do what they were doing, unlike the other colonies. Okay, so did these laws describe the reality, the legal laws at the time? Most slaves did own some form of property, right? Doesn't always mean land. That could mean they owned an instrument, okay? That doesn't mean it was great, right? Obviously, it just means that they did have some property. Some could try to make money. Eventually, there's laws that ban this in some areas, but at this point, they could. Most commonly, it was for musicians. And some still had free times on Saturdays and Sundays. It still doesn't mean they were free. Just meant they weren't working every single hour of every day. Why did slavery last so long? Well, because it was profitable. Remember, this is unfortunately all about economics. This was an agrarian area at the time. There wasn't a need to industrialize yet. It was also a means of social control. And you see how this becomes really important here. And it says in 17 something, and I don't know what I was trying to write there. Let me check 1 second. I don't know, but maybe it was this. In 1700, of every 400 slaves, 25% of them would die within the first year. Women averaged up to 23 years of age when they came. So maybe that's what I was getting at. I'm not sure. But because of this system, this is why the pro-slavery attitude developed more so in the South than in the North. So the pre-revolution slavery does differ a lot from post-revolution.